Welcome to this week's episode of Saulcast, where we'll be talking about Season 4, Episode 4 of Better Call Saul, titled Talk. This episode was written by Heather Marion and directed by John Scheiben. We already talked about this episode briefly in our instant take right after the episode aired, but today we'll be taking you through our full recap and analysis. I'm Gil.
I'm Adam.
Let's get into it.
I got a job.
Have a good first day.
The guy's story changes every time he tells it.
I'm sorry, my plans have changed.
You have something to tell me? You would be well advised to do so.
Nacho's story starts out with the Westward Ho Motel. Towards the beginning of the episode, we see a scene there where one of the guys who works for Gus goes and has a drug transaction at the Westward Ho Motel, drops off some drugs, gets paid, gets back in the car where Victor is waiting for him. And a little bit later in the episode, we see Nacho in a car with the twins parked outside of that same motel where we saw the drug transaction take place earlier. The twins ask him, hey, that silver car over there, those are the guys that ran you off the road and shot you? And of course they ask that without using any words. And when Nacho confirms, he says, but hey, this place is like a fortress. We're going to have to call for backup. And before he can finish his sentence, the twins get out of the car and wreak havoc.
It looked like a hellhole. It reminded me of Tuco's headquarters back in Breaking Bad. Remember when Walt walked in and threw that chemical at the ground and blew up that whole apartment?
Yes. Yeah, one of the great scenes from early on Breaking Bad.
Right, and he just kind of walks out casually, and there's all the neighbors looking on. It looks like the kind of neighborhood where this sort of stuff is expected.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, repeatedly this show has I've made this comment, I think in pretty much every episode we've recorded so far, but I'm so glad that I don't work in the drug trade, that I'm not involved in any hard drugs. Nothing about that place looked, even for a moment when you think, you hear some music, and you think that sounds like fun, as you get closer to it and you see what's happening in the room, and it's just people that look half dead. And for some reason, every room has a different hue, a different color. There's like a blue room, a green room. Everything about it was just not pleasant. So the scene with the twins going in and basically taking out the entire basically everybody that's in that motel, it seems like, was killed by the twins. But while they're in there, we don't actually see any of it happening on camera. You hear a lot of gunshots. You see some explosions. Nacho decides to take it upon himself when he sees some backup arrive. He gets out of the car, and even wounded, limping, he goes to shoot a couple of the guys that showed up. And but anyway, some highlights from this scene that I picked out. When the twins are shooting, you hear one guy just yell at them, "Give yourselves up, you idiots!" And I just love the fact that they use the insult "idiots" because it's such an innocuous term. It's like what I would say to you if you were bugging me. Like, could you stop it, you idiot?
Yeah, it's like, hey, you jerks, stop killing us.
Yeah,
it's not, you're being mean.
Right, if someone pulls a gun on you and you're like, you idiot, put that away.
Yeah. These guys are ruthless killers. Mm-hmm. And it makes perfect sense that they were kind of groomed by Hector Salamanca. Mm-hmm. It fits so well. These two people took out an entire crime family and their henchmen.
Mm-hmm. And do you think there must have been bystanders in that motel, right? All the people that are drugged out and just kind of living there. Do you think the twins left them alone, or were they, caught in the crossfire, just collateral damage?
Okay. So as you're asking that question, my first thought is, I don't think they would go out of their way to shoot them. Mm-hmm. But if they're in the way, if any bystanders are in the way, they will not hesitate to kill them.
Yeah.
But then I remembered the scene from Breaking Bad, the shootout with Hank. I remember a woman walking out of a store holding some bags who sees what's happening and stupidly draws attention to herself and screams and starts running away, and they just shoot her in the back. So it wouldn't surprise me if they if they just killed anyone in sight just because.
Yeah. Well, they can't leave any witnesses is I think the problem.
Yeah, I guess, but they cause so much carnage. I don't know. Maybe that's part of the thought process, but I think more so it's just that they're programmed to kill everything.
Right. They're like, if you could see from their point of view, it would be like how they show what a robot sees. Scanning, human life, destroy, not a Salamanca, kill.
Yeah, there's like a red target. Yeah, exactly. Every time one of them gets the urge to speak, it just starts flashing in their mind. Warning.
So the big takeaway from this scene is that the Espinosas, who function out of the Westward Home Motel, have been eradicated by the twins. The next time we see Nacho, he's laying on a floor, sweating, clutching his stomach. Basically, ever since he got shot, we've watched Nacho in a constant state of pain. Always looks like he's about to faint. So we've said many times he's not doing well, but I think that if you had the scale that, how on election night, the New York Times will have that little needle that points to, the probability of either candidate winning. Here, the scale being, is Nacho going to survive this series? I feel like that is just constantly moving more and more towards things are not looking good for Nacho.
Yeah, I think so. There's always a chance that they will surprise us.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be that they're setting us up for a surprise, but I also wouldn't be surprised if things went the way that they look like they're going.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. And one more word on the twins. So I think what ends up happening with them is one of them gets shot in the shoulder, right?
That's right, yeah.
Which is a miracle that's all that happened.
Yeah.
And they're going to go, I think they're going down to Mexico to lay low for a little bit now.
Right, exactly. They went, so when Nacho's laying in that warehouse, Gus walks in and basically Nacho gives him the status update, which is Espinosas are done. The twins are fine. One of them got hurt a little bit. They're going down south until the heat dies down. And that's where we get some answers on what Gus is doing with Nacho.
We cleared out the Espinosas. They're all done.
And the Salamanca brothers?
Marco took a hit, but he'll pull through. They went back south until the heat dies down. It's territory, isn't it? Salamancas wipe out the Espinosas. Espinosa territory isn't for grabs. Cartel can't give it to the Salamancas, so I think they gave it to you.
Get some rest.
Nacho calls him out. He says, this was over territory, right? Salamancas take out the Espinosas, and now it's yours.
Yeah, Nacho's pretty perceptive. He's not the best at anything on this show, but he does show some more intellect than the average the average person involved in this.
And if Nacho is on to Gus, and clearly he's started to piece together the plan here, why tell Gus? Doesn't that feel a little bit like showing your hand?
Yeah, well, and that might get to some of Nacho's flaws, as I see them.
Well, when Nacho calls out Gus, we have a line that's very much in the spirit of one of your favorite Gusisms, right? The get back to work, which we talked about on the Instant Take. And specifically what Gus says to Nacho is, get some rest. You have more to do.
Right. So here's one thought as to why Nacho might have played his hand, like you just said. Gus says, get some rest, we have more work to do. As much as Gus is cold and heartless and doesn't care about Nacho as a person and sees him just as a pawn, Gus understands investment. And Nacho's an investment. He's putting work into this, and he's putting a lot of careful planning. So, yeah, it actually makes sense that he wants Nacho not to die from his wounds, right? And wants him to get some rest. If Nacho can demonstrate some understanding of Gus's general plan and show that he's going along with it anyway, well, then Gus gets a little more reason to keep Nacho around, a little more reason to invest some more into him, not out of any kind of concern or care about him as a person, but he's strategically useful. And so we talked before about how Nacho doesn't have, I can't picture many ways Nacho gets out of this alive, but one of the few possibilities maybe is if he demonstrates to Gus that he is indispensable.
Right, and he is playing it smart, because in most other shows or movies where you see a character in this situation where somebody has blackmail on them, or one way or another the person has to comply with somebody else, that character always goes along with it begrudgingly. Like they say, do it. No, do it. Fine. But Nacho, he just does it. He doesn't show any emotion about it. He knows what has to be done. So I think he's in a pretty impossible situation, but he knows that he needs to play it the way Gus wants him to play it, and maybe he's waiting to see an opening. He's trying to, I think, to what you said, he's showing some awareness of what's going on, and maybe he can get on Gus's good side, or at least make Gus see him as a useful asset.
Right. And Nacho's fairly perceptive, and his ability to realize this plan and the way in which the twins' actions actually benefited Gus, that shows some intelligence, like we said. What I wonder is, how come the twins didn't know how their actions might benefit Gus? I think the answer is not all that complicated. We jokingly call them robots and Terminators, but I think they are fairly one-dimensional. I don't think they're thinking very much. I think they hear that these people attack Nacho, and so their operating system is, okay, so we strike back. They don't really think who benefits when we do that, what potential consequences might happen on the larger turf war.
And you think if Hector were awake, conscious right now, he would have advised against that?
As much pride and stupidity as Hector has, he's at least probably thinking more on that level than the twins are. I think Hector still would have taken the bait and fallen for it, but he's probably thinking more about the larger game than the twins are.
Right. No, agreed. I think you do see a bit of the emotional side to Hector, where he'd probably have the same impulse that the twins do, but I think you would just hope that with all of his experience, that would, give him enough ammunition to say, no, we've got to hold back. We'll hit them eventually, but it's not the right time right now. Nacho's story in this episode basically closes out with him at his father's house. He once again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, he doesn't look good. His father wants to call the police, and Nacho says, no, I'm okay. Just let me rest here for a little bit. And we leave Nacho for this episode.
Yeah. You got to feel for Nacho.
Yeah. I do.
Yeah. He has no real choices here, and he's also very sick.
Mm-hmm. If anybody's heart wasn't already broken for Nacho, I think the part that will do it is when his father goes to call the police and Nacho looks up at him and he looks like he's about to collapse, and he says, "Can I just rest here for a little bit?"
Yeah, it's like he can't even get medical treatment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that's really rough.
Yeah.
Moving on to the Kim and Jimmy story, or as I like to say, Kimmy.
Oh. Is that, by the way, did we coin that, or does that already exist on the subreddits and Twitter?
I'm sure it exists, but I haven't heard it before.
Yeah, I haven't. I think we take credit for that.
We see Jimmy in an overhead shot of him in his bed, which I'm noticing they do a lot this season, and I don't think they did it as much in previous seasons. And it's interesting because every time they show him in his bed, it's a very different kind of mood. You know, there was that one scene where you see the flames from Chuck's house kind of in a surreal way floating over his head. You see another time where he's again lying in bed and he's contemplating stealing the Hummel figure. And now this time he's waking up in bed and he gets a phone call from CC Mobile, which wants to hire him. And so what that tells us is he actually did go on some more job interviews in which he didn't cause any kind of scene or screw things up. So that's the first thing to take away from that. But so he gets that job and immediately basically turns it down. Then he has a change of heart after he talks to Kim, who suggests that he see a psychologist.
What's up?
I was thinking that maybe you should talk to someone.
Yeah?
Yeah. I got a name. He's not far from here. I've heard good things. Thought you could give him a call.
It's a shrink?
It works for a lot of people.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, well, thank you. Just have to check out my schedule and... Oh, jeez.
He kind of blows it
I almost
off,
forgot to
but
tell you.
says that he will. Then lies
I got a
about
job.
becoming a shift supervisor for CC Mobile. And so either he has a change of heart and he's like, okay, I'll give this thing a shot, or maybe some part of his conscience says, I shouldn't really lie to Kim, so I just will take the job now that I lied. I think most likely it's not a conscience thing. It's, you know what? It would actually be convenient for me to have a good cover story for being out of the house, and having a real job to back it up would be great.
I do love the idea of Jimmy retroactively turning his lies into truth, that he says he got the job, so he needs to sort of catch reality up to that lie and say, okay, let me go back and actually get that job I turned down.
Yeah. That's a really great summation of his character, I think.
Right, which in a way is respectable. I mean, this is the part of the episode where whenever I watch this show, I think I always bounce back and forth between, I wish I was more like Jimmy, or I'm glad I'm not Jimmy. And this is one of the scenes where I'm in the, I wish I were more like Jimmy mode, where he kind of just keeps moving forward and identifies what he needs in the moment and gets it. I don't want the job with CC, what's it called? The cell phone company? I don't want the job with CC Mobile, so he turns it down. 10 minutes later, I want the job. It would be super awkward to call them back and say I want it, but I'm just going to go ahead and do it anyway. He does lie, but the way that he lies and then bends reality to make his lies true, it would be a useful skill to have.
Yeah, well, we'll see where it gets him.
Mm-hmm.
But I at least admire the confidence.
Mm-hmm. And one thing I before we moved on from it, you mentioned how we've seen the shot of Jimmy lying in bed a few times. Mm-hmm. And I've talked a couple times about how I think one of the major themes or questions that this show is tackling is it's sort of looking at our relationship with our profession. And I think one of the classic things within that realm is one of the only times of the day where you can really be you is when you're lying in bed, because the moment you get up, you start your day, you're at work, and you basically turn into, the corporate zombie. So I wonder if showing Jimmy in bed is meant to sort of evoke that for you and make you ponder, what is Jimmy thinking about right now? Or this is the time of day where he's, where his brain is just, the gears are turning and he's thinking about life.
Yeah, when you first wake up in the morning and you have no filter, you're just kind of raw emotion, and if you have to go to work that day, usually it's not the most positive ones.
Right. It reminds me of a Dilbert comic I read like 10 years ago.
Oh, I know where you're going.
You know this one?
Yeah, I love this.
This is Dilbert wakes up in bed and he sort of slowly starts to remember his life. He thinks to himself, okay, I'm waking up. I'm an engineer. That's right. I have to get up. I have to go to work. And he slowly remembers everything. And then the last panel says, morning amnesia, the only thing that stops you from waking up screaming every day.
Oh my God. It's so funny and so dark and so unfortunately true.
That reminds me of, do you mind if I go on a quick tangent for a second about Dilbert?
Please.
Years ago, I read this Dilbert comic that for some reason just struck a chord with me. And it was so funny that literally throughout the day, I would think about the comic and just start laughing, like in the middle of the day by myself. And I went out to lunch with a few coworkers, and I told them the comic that I read. And all of them laughed in the car, except for the driver. And then later that night, I went to a party at that guy's house, and on the other side of the room, I overhear him with a group of people around him he goes, I read this great Dilbert comic today. And he tells the comic that I told him about.
Whoa.
Yeah.
What a sociopath.
Yeah.
See, he deliberately didn't laugh just to give a good cover to, how could I possibly steal your funny relaying of another funny comic if I didn't even find it funny in the first place?
Yeah, he pulled a Slippin' Jimmy on me.
Yeah. Yeah, you know what it's like to get conned.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. That's disturbing.
Yeah. Should I call him out right now and just say his full name and get him? We could dox him.
We could dox him.
Yeah.
I feel like we probably only get one dox a season.
So we should save it. We'll save it.
Yeah, we'll save it for someone who deserves it even more. We talked about this a little bit in the instant take. It seems like you don't think that Jimmy will end up seeing the shrink.
No, I don't think you will.
Yeah. I don't think he will either, but I really, really want him to because I think it would be hilarious. And just because it would be that funny, I think there's a chance he will.
Oh, man. I can picture it. I can picture the scene in my head, and it would be so much fun. Just because there's so many ways that he can play it. I mean, if he played it totally serious and we actually got to witness a therapy session with Jimmy being Jimmy, that would be a great scene. That's probably not how it would play out. More likely he would try and sort of show the therapist that he's wasting his time and give non-serious answers, and it would be a hilarious scene. It would either be super insightful, hilarious. You know what? Most likely it would be hilarious and insightful, I guess, which is what the show usually aims for. So I hope it happens. My prediction is that it doesn't.
Yeah, I think it probably won't, but I hope it does. I think we're starting to see a rift forming between Kim and Jimmy.
Mm-hmm.
It looks like there was no animosity or anything like that, but there wasn't much affection, and I know it was just one scene, but I think Kim is a little bit wigged out by Jimmy's grief response, or how she might see it as Jimmy becoming distant or dissociated from what happened to Chuck as a coping mechanism, and that's why she thinks, you probably need someone to talk to. But I also think that it's not just out of concern for him that this is coming up, but from her perspective, it might be a little disconcerting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, during the instant take when you said that there was tension between Kim and Jimmy, and I was like, no, there wasn't. Things were fine between them. What are you talking about? I don't know why I didn't pick up on it, but there's clearly tension, and I think the angle I was missing is that, of course, Kim would have a problem with the way Jimmy's acting. Whether it's concern, like you said, maybe she's just disturbed by the fact that Jimmy is not showing any emotion following his brother's death. But the other angle I could see is that she feels like he's shutting her out. Maybe she thinks that he is feeling something and he's not telling her, which would probably make her angry, or it would make her concerned. I thought we had a real relationship. Why isn't he talking to me right now? That's a whole layer that I just, for some reason, just didn't pick up on, the first go around.
Yeah, and the show never seems to make that kind of stuff explicit. I think it requires, in order to get a sense for what's going on between them as a couple, there's a lot of reading between the lines going on, because their relationship is fairly complex, and we don't see them being affectionate that often, but we know that the affection exists and probably gets expressed between them because they live together and they seem to like each other a lot. But it makes sense, just like in Breaking Bad, as with this show, that's not the central focus, and so it would almost be too cliche or stereotypical, like any other show, if they made the romantic plot like a real centerpiece. Mm-hmm. So I kind of like that they leave it a little bit up to the viewer to fill in the blanks.
Right, exactly. Which I think is also realistic. I mean, it's very rare that things are explicitly stated when there are issues in a relationship. Usually they fester, underneath the surface. And I'm not speaking from personal experience here, but that's usually how it works, I think.
As far as you can tell, from movies and stuff.
Right, exactly.
Kim then goes to the public courthouse, and at this point, we don't really know why she's doing this. She's sitting in on a case, and it's pretty clear that she's got nothing to do with it, and the case has nothing to do with anything we've seen before. And so we don't really know why she's there, and then the judge asks her to meet her in his chambers. Calling it his chambers really glorifies it when it's really just kind of a basic office, and he's just sitting there eating his eggplant and okra. Mm-hmm. As you pointed out in the instant take, just talking to her between chews, the same way Jimmy did as he was eating the cereal.
You're not going to find meaning in the law, Kim. You better stick to making money and stop wasting your time in my court.
Yeah, exactly. The only thing missing from that scene was him, like, as he was doing that, picking up a handkerchief and dabbing the sweat off his forehead. But right, yeah, exactly what you just said. The judge does this hilarious thing, which this is one of those things that this is one of those types of dialogue, like monologues, that no one ever really gives in real life. But it was still effective in the show, where he's recommending a case. He's very dramatic about it. A young woman pregnant with her first child has a problem with the anesthesia, and she aspirates her vomit. The baby's fine, but the mom has brain damage. Blah, blah, blah. It's, the case of the century. And then she's like, yeah, that's the plot of The Verdict, which is a movie I haven't seen. And he basically says, this is the real world. You're not going to rediscover a love for law just hanging out in my courtroom. And then he says what you just said, stick to Mesa Verde, make lots of money, give a little to charity. And he doesn't want her there. He basically says, get out of my courtroom, and next time I see you here, I'm going to put you to work. I think he's kind of challenging her almost, saying, you want to find meaning in the law? Like, you got to get your hands dirty. You can't, maybe you're spoiled by this Mesa Verde stuff. Just go back to that. It's almost a challenge. If, see if she sticks around, maybe she's serious. I think it's 50-50. I think he wanted to get rid of her. That was his main motivation. But it did read a little bit like one of those kind of methods of motivating someone by doubting them.
It's an interesting read. I didn't take it that way at all. For me, you said 50-50. For me, it was the other 50, which was just an ass kicking of, what are you doing? Like, you should have lost the idealism by now. Just get back to work.
Get back to work.
I'm setting you up for it.
Yeah, that's how I interpreted it at first. It was only after I thought about it recently that I started to take a different point of view, specifically because of the line where he said, next time I see you here, I'll put you to work. Meaning, if you are going to keep showing up, you're going to have to do something. So probably you're going to have to act as a public defender, right? So why would he say that if he didn't want her there at all, if he completely didn't want her there? What he's saying is, if you're going to go here to try to rediscover your passion for the law, like you got to be ready to work and get your hands dirty.
Right, you're not going to just sit around and wait for the perfect case to pounce on.
Yeah, exactly.
You're going to have to, like everybody else, you're going to have to take the crappy cases, and every once in a while, you'll find one that gives you meaning. I could see it playing out that way.
Yeah, and I think that that's all too realistic for almost any job. If you're pursuing a career that you're interested in, I think most of the time, the work you'll end up doing there is boring and it's not really what you signed up for. But what could make it worth it is that thing that comes up, that project or that patient or that case that comes up once in a while that feels like it made everything else worth sticking it out.
So can I drop a bombshell for you right now?
Go for it.
Remember when I said I have 2 criticisms for this episode?
Yeah, are we about to hear one?
This is the first one. Do you remember about 10 minutes ago when you talked about how the relationship between Jimmy and Kim is very subtle? It's not very explicit. Things aren't spelled out. So here we have Kim clearly down last episode. We can't really tell what's going on in her head. And the way they communicate it is another character sees her and is able to be so perceptive that he's able to piece together everything that's going on in her mind psychologically. And then the judge lays it all out for us. It felt a little bit on the nose to me. It stretched credulity a little bit that he would really be able to look at her and figure out that's what she was going through. I didn't hate the scene. The way they went about it was awesome. Having him recite the plot to the verdict was hilarious. But it did feel to me a little bit like it was a convenient way to communicate that, which they were being very subtle about it last episode, and in this episode it was made very explicit.
Did that at all hinder your enjoyment of the show, or was it just something you picked up on and said and thought it didn't really have to be that explicit?
Right. It took me out of it for a moment, but I was right back to it, 30 seconds later.
I think you should cut them some slack.
Yeah. But you know what? Why don't you just cut that part out?
Yeah. I don't want that negativity in here.
Yeah.
No, I see what you're saying, though. I do think there were probably ways to get the point across in a more subtle way. That would have been more in line with the way the show usually does things.
Right.
But ultimately, I didn't really I don't have a problem with it. I didn't pick up on it at the time, but as you say it to me now, I kind of see what you're saying. And then picking up with Jimmy, we see him at CC Mobile, and it's just so funny to see him in that environment. You mentioned this last time, and I agree that it reminded me of the scenes of him at Cinnabon. Working a menial job, not one he cares about. It's probably very boring. The difference here is he can be himself, and that's what makes it kind of funny, because you see him going around organizing and cleaning. Like he wants to do something, he wants something to do. He wants a job or a task. You see him bored and pacing around. He keeps popping out and waiting in the parking lot as though he's going to see. If anyone's coming in to shop for a cell phone, they'll walk in. But he has to go out and just look and make sure there's no cars coming. Then he comes back in as the phone rings and he talks to his boss, basically. And I thought that conversation was great. It's just, how's the first morning going? It's good, but it's a little slow. He goes, yeah, this is one of the slower stores. Bring a book. It seems like that's just going to be his normal day indefinitely, except for inventory week, which he just missed. And I can surmise that it only happens once a year. Another thing I liked about the scene was when we see Jimmy bouncing the ball on the wall just to pass the time. It reminded me of when Jesse was in the new lab in Breaking Bad, in that laundry in that laundry place. Where they're in that underground super lab. We see Jesse taking like some air compressor and sticking it into his like his hazard suit and blowing it up and jumping back and forth. Like what? So, just finding ways to pass the time and just being like a child. What I liked about that scene of Jesse with the inflated suit bouncing around was someone made a parody of Breaking Bad that was on YouTube called "What If Breaking Bad Was a Sitcom?" Something like that, and it just showed the opening, like the theme of what a starting for a Breaking Bad sitcom would look like. And one of the little clips they spliced in was just Jesse bouncing around in his inflated suit. It just fits so well. So yeah, Jimmy bouncing that ball just kind of reminded me of that.
Mm-hmm.
Just someone being out of place and bored and not knowing what to do.
Right. And as much as we've said a few times that Nacho reminds us of Jesse, this is a pretty solid reminder that they're very different characters. I can't really imagine Nacho doing the whole inflatable suit thing.
Yeah, I think he'd pop some stitches if he tried right now.
Yeah. Don't forget about your bowels. Stop.
Yeah, that's one of my main concerns during a Nacho scene is that I'm just thinking about his bowels. I spent 3 weeks thinking about this guy's bowels.
I know. Twice a week we get together and we're like, so, all right, bowel check.
Yeah,
How we doing?
We need a Nacho bowel update.
Yeah.
His status on his bowels, still kind of shitty.
Yeah. Oh, dude. You just put this podcast on the map.
Oh, yeah. Jimmy does the classic, I'm just going to change the open sign to closed, and he ditches the place. We see him getting in that crappy old car that he has, that yellow car with the red door.
Right.
And he drives over to Ira. I love the meeting of Saul with Ira. It's exactly what I would have hoped for. This Ira character, great guy, aside from being criminal.
Yeah, it looks like when I said that Jimmy may have made a new friend, I was onto something here. I'm so happy they brought Ira back.
Yeah, it really sounded like wishful thinking at the time that you said that, but it seems like you were right.
Which makes me think that maybe next episode we will see Jimmy and the therapist. Because so far this show has been giving us exactly what we ask for every week.
Yeah, I should ask it for some money.
Yeah.
We see Jimmy talk to Ira, and Ira, no problem whatsoever, just hands him over his share of the money. As Jimmy's counting the money, I'm like, oh, thank God everything went well. Like, I knew we could count on Ira. This is the one time we see honor among thieves. It's great.
Right.
Then I'm like, oh no, something's wrong. Jimmy looks surprised and he's like, wait a minute. And I'm like, God, something has to go wrong every time. Why? Then he's like, this is more than I was expecting. I was so happy with that.
I love this guy, Ira. He's so great.
Yeah. Yeah, and he basically says, you know what, the Hummel figure, there was a huge bidding war for it, and it ended up selling for more than we thought, and Jimmy's like, you could have kept most of this, what gives? And Ira says, well, you could have left me there high, you could have kept me high and dry.
Yeah.
So he respects that Jimmy went and saved him from that terrible situation with the boss and the pizza.
Mm-hmm.
And so he reciprocated and gave Jimmy his share.
Yeah.
And Ira, I think he's a genuinely kind of a good guy in the sense of personal interaction.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. All the thievery aside. But on top of that, I think it's pretty clear he's interested in finding more jobs like this.
Right.
So he wants to keep Jimmy on his good side. He says, got any more where that came from? He wants to find another job. At this point, Jimmy's got nothing for him, but he says, I got a new phone now, so you can call me on that. You never know who's listening. This is when something clicks in Jimmy's head, and I think it's a bigger deal than it might look. I think this really is Jimmy starting to become Saul for real. And I thought more about what that actually means. What's the difference between Jimmy and Saul?
Right.
And I think the difference is Jimmy is a criminal, a thief, a con artist. Saul is a resource for criminals, thieves, and con artists.
Right.
He is a criminal lawyer. He likes to learn about the needs of criminals and help them do what they're going to do. He gets to the point where he's not really doing the crimes themselves. He's advising criminals and helping them do it in a way that buffers them from the law. Right? So that's why he liked finding out about this phone thing. And when we see him implement what I just said directly, when he says, okay, I'm going to go back to the store and I'm going to say, is the man listening? Privacy sold here. Right? He wants to market to criminals. He doesn't want to be the criminal.
That is brilliant. You're so spot on with that. It didn't occur to me the last time we were talking, but this really is, I mean, two examples. The Hummel, he didn't steal it himself. He pointed him to it, which is still probably more criminal than what Saul would do, right? Saul doesn't bring you the opportunity. So that's one step towards it. But this idea of marketing cell phones to people who are worried about privacy, probably criminals, that is the most Saul-like thing we've seen, where you're right. He's a resource for the criminals. He's not the criminal himself.
Yeah, and that's kind of the perfect balance for this character who, he has his troubled past as Slippin' Jimmy. It didn't bring him fulfillment, but there was something addictive about it. There was something inherent in his character that drew him to that kind of lifestyle. But there's the other part that he's torn regarding law and being a lawyer and kind of leading a more legitimate life. And this is kind of the ultimate marriage between those two lives for him. So that's why I love that scene for so many reasons. And in retrospect, that insight about Jimmy becoming Saul really makes that scene even better on a whole new level.
Yeah, agreed. I think the way I initially reacted to that scene was this is another one of Jimmy's sales tactics that's probably going to do well, but it's going to get him in trouble. After the episode or the next day, I thought about it more and I realized, hold on, this isn't just a sales tactic. He's trying to market to criminals, and this is probably going to turn into something more. And I realized that pretty shortly after. And then with you adding this other layer, and you asked me if this is the first step or an important step in Jimmy becoming Saul, and I didn't see it at first, but I think you captured it perfectly here, and I definitely see that clicking now.
Right. Yeah, Saul is a consultant. He doesn't do the dirty work.
I do have one prediction here, which Ira sort of reminds me of John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, where so Jimmy is Steve Martin, and if you haven't seen the movie, basically John Candy is this happy-go-lucky, sort of a doofus character. Steve Martin's more the serious one, but just bad stuff keeps happening to him the whole movie. But anyway, you could sort of view John Candy as this sort of naive person, and at a certain point in the movie, Steve Martin yells at him, and as the audience, you feel incredibly bad for John Candy. I think we're going to have that moment between Jimmy and Ira, because I think that it was awesome to see Ira give Jimmy more than what he really had to give him. He could have gotten away with keeping more money. It was great to see that. But I suspect that part of Jimmy looks at that and says, you're being foolish. Like, to trust somebody this much, this is a mistake. And I wonder if Jimmy's either going to betray Ira or call him out. But at some point later this season, you and I are going to feel really bad for Ira. That's my prediction.
I hope not, but some evidence to back up your prediction is the way Jimmy told off the copy guy about how dumb it was to trust him. And I could have been a serial killer. Not exactly the same thing, but it does remind me of he doesn't necessarily respect suckers, right? That
exactly.
sort of defines him as a person because of the way he grew up seeing his dad being taken advantage of. And I think he can't really distinguish very well between people who are just being good, honest people and suckers. To him, they're all one and the same. And so, yeah, if he sees a character like Ira, who's, this honest thief, relatively speaking, maybe Jimmy likes that at first, but it could also cause him to lose some respect for him. That said, we do know that Ira continues to play a role in Breaking Bad, so it's possible they have a falling out, but I don't know if it could be that destructive.
Right. They'll say that in Breaking Bad. I don't remember if Ira and Saul were really interacting. And one other thing I'll have to admit is before the season started, there were interviews with Vince Gilligan, and people asked him, what can we look forward to this season? Like, can you give us any hints? And he smiled and he said, watch Planes, Trains, and Automobiles.
Are you serious?
No, I'm sorry.
That would have been bizarre.
Your eyes lit up. You're like, are you serious?
Yeah.
The episode actually starts with a flashback where we see a person with his face obscured, cutting wood, pouring cement. It's a sort of happy montage with upbeat music playing, and you see a child in the background watching this guy building something. It kind of gives the vibe of a classic, kid watching his dad build something sort of vibe. So do you know what and it ends with the kid writing his name in the concrete, Matty. So as soon as we see him write that, if you remember the name, then you know that this is a flashback of Mike Ehrmantraut and his son.
Yeah. And I did not remember the name Matty. And for me, it was kind of a roller coaster of predictions, because at first I thought that we were seeing Mike on the screen.
Mm-hmm.
Then when I saw the kid, and then I saw more of that person, I was like, I'm not so sure. Then I was like, nah, it's not Mike. It's probably just a random person, the same way we had a random person when that guy's badge was stolen.
Right.
And I think you said a similar thing in the instant take.
Mm-hmm.
Then I was like, wait a minute. The way that guy, the gait on the guy, like the way he kind of lumbered around, as young as Mike is supposed to be in that scene, he walked a little bit like an old man.
Right. Which I have to say, by the way, you said that in the instant take, and I couldn't believe that you recognized him based off of his gait. And so I rewatched it, and I still don't see it. I don't know how you picked up on that, but that's impressive. And I'm sure it was intentional too.
Yeah, I mean, it probably was just acted by Mike. So it would make sense. It's also possible that I'm, in retrospect, just trying to come up with a way that I made that guess, and maybe it was just lucky.
Mm-hmm. By the way, it was not acted by Mike. They actually cast a lookalike, somebody that looks like Mike Ehrmantraut, but they ended up not showing his face anyway. But they said that they really could have shown his face from a distance, and it looked quite like him.
Yeah, I guess they probably just didn't know in advance if they would end up using a visual of the face or not. I can't imagine a young Mike.
Yeah. I don't know what it would look like. Obviously we can look it up, but I sort of don't want to.
I know. I don't want to ruin the magic.
Yeah. So do you know what he was building in that scene?
No, I thought like maybe it's like a sidewalk or something, but I really don't know.
I think it's funny that your theory is that he was building a sidewalk.
Yeah, I know.
But it was a carport. He was making a carport.
Carport?
Yeah, it's like a garage, but it's kind of more open, and it sort of covers up a car that you can park there. And how could one possibly know that he was building a carport? Because this is a flashback to something we've actually heard about. Back in season 3, episode 6, Stacy is trying to convince Mike to lay the cement for a playground they're going to build at the church. And she tells Mike, Maddie told me that he once saw you build a whole carport on your own because you didn't want to pay for the contractors.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Callback.
I did my research.
That's impressive.
We cut from the flashback to a flash forward where we're right in Mike's face and he says, he wanted me to talk. I talked. And then you sort of zoom out and you see that Mike is at group therapy. Clearly, he's just said something which has shocked and awed everybody in the room. The next time we see Mike, he's at the diner, the diner with Fran, and he meets a friend of his from group therapy, Anita. They exchange pleasantries. I think she was flirting with him a little bit.
Yeah.
She invited him to go see her friend play piano at a bar.
Yeah, and I think with the flirting, 22 across on their crossword, Esmeralda, which is the love interest of the Hunchback, or Quasimodo, in The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I think the implication is that Mike is the Hunchback.
which you already recognized him based off of his lumbering around gait earlier.
Yeah, so from now on he's a hunchback in my mind. She basically does ask him out on a date. And ready for some trivia?
Yeah, go for it.
All right. I'll quiz you. I don't know how you could possibly remember this, but do you know how Walter and Skylar met for the first time?
They went to go see The Hunchback of Notre Dame, the play.
No.
Oh.
Apparently, they were working on a crossword. They bonded over working on crossword puzzles. Furthermore, another nested layer of trivia. Ready? Esmeralda, 22 across. That's the name that Marie suggested Skylar and Walt name their baby, which is a terrible name. Terrible suggestion. I think Esmeralda is not the best name.
No, I agree. It's a little outdated.
What, is it ever indated?
I mean, the Hunchback had bigger problems than... Look, if Esmeralda is... if the Hunchback has a shot with Esmeralda, he's not going to say, look, I would, but your name, the name's a little bit outdated, I have to say, Esmeralda. I'm going to have to say no to this one. I'm sorry.
I didn't know that Woody Allen played the Hunchback. Or George Costanza. You know what? George Costanza would end a relationship over that.
He would, yeah.
But yeah, it's just like Marie to suggest a name like Esmeralda. She was weird.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's my little trivia for that diner scene.
So Mike and Anita are flirting a little bit, and then she makes a comment that she thinks they should check in on Henry. Right? What was his name? Yeah, Henry. Because Henry's not doing well, and Mike says, don't worry about Henry, he's doing fine. She said, did you talk to Henry? He goes, no, I didn't talk to Henry. I don't need to talk to Henry because the dead wife he's been telling you about didn't exist. And she basically says, you're a very suspicious person, and they decide to make a bet. $10 says that tonight when they go to group, Henry's going to change his story. And I told you I had 2 criticisms for this episode.
Oh, this was going to be my criticism.
Really?
Yeah.
Let's see if we have the same one.
Let's try to describe our criticism in one word, okay? And on the count of 3, we'll say it, and we'll see if we have the same one, okay?
Mm-hmm.
1, 2, 3.
Wrist.
Yeah. That was just a little too cliche for me.
Right. He has a tell. Every time he lies, he touches his wrist.
Yeah.
It's just, yeah, exactly. It's so cliche and on the nose. Do people actually have tells where every time they lie, they do a specific thing?
Probably, and I think detectives are trained in these things, and they learn a lot about body language. So it's not out of the question, but it's too much of a trope.
Right, exactly. And I did say during the instant take that I have 2 criticisms, one of which I think is actually somewhat legitimate. The legitimate one I was referring to was my earlier one about the judge and Kim. This was the one where I thought, look, in reality, people probably do have tells, but like you said, it's just such a trope. And you hate to see Mike play into a cliche like that. But it was brief, moved past it quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, it didn't actually bug me until after the fact when I thought about it some more.
Later on, we see Mike in group therapy, and we have Stacy, Mike's daughter-in-law, talking about how recently she went almost half a day without thinking about Maddie at all. And she saw this as a bad thing. She was afraid that she might forget about him, forget the way he sounds, how he looked. And the leader of the group says, I actually see that as progress. That's something that a lot of us in this room have gone through. And that's actually was my reaction, too, when she was talking. I think people have a hard time, moving past someone that's no longer in their life, and you think about them constantly. And when you find yourself having been able to go a certain amount of time without fixating on them, it's actually a sign that you're getting better and getting past them. That's how I read it. But I'm curious what your take.
Yeah, as she was telling the story, I thought she was relaying it as a sign that she's actually starting to move on from her grief. And I think she saw it. I think she saw both sides of it. So I think part of her is probably recognizing that she's moving past it, but she doesn't want to move past it.
Right. And she even says, I know I'm not really going to forget him. I think she recognizes that her feelings here are not exactly rational. And, I think at a certain point she'll realize that it's actually a good thing, and she'll be able to have a more functional life where she's not falling apart constantly.
You know what's funny? When she says that she thinks of Maddie every time she makes breakfast, I was like, you know what? There's someone I think of every time breakfast is being made.
Walt's son?
Yeah, Walt Jr.
What was it that he liked? Waffles?
Bacon. I think it was pancakes.
Okay.
I mean, who prefers waffles to pancakes?
I think wasn't it okra?
Yeah. Walt Jr. was all about that okra breakfast.
Every scene he was in the background chomping down on okra.
Yeah.
Hey, Dad, look how much okra I can fit in my mouth.
Oh, man. You know what? No wonder Walt snapped.
Well, so after the leader of the group tells Stacy, look, we've all been through this, Henry decides to butt in, and he says, oh, I know I have. My wife, back when she passed away, I have a friend that just came back from Sydney. I've been avoiding him for 2 weeks. And as he talks, Mike can't take it anymore, and he says, oh my God, and basically cuts him off.
I love Mike.
Yeah, I love that. He won't stand for it. And there's been a trend the last couple episodes of people getting called out on their BS. Right? Jimmy calling out the guys that were going to hire him, and now Mike calling out this guy. There's a general trend of people just being sick and tired of people lying to themselves, lying to others, suckers.
Yeah, I think you're right. A lot of chickens are coming home to roost.
Right, exactly. Basically, the leader says, Mike, you have something to say? He's hesitant, but eventually he talks. And he lays out everything on the table. He says, Henry, you've never had a wife. And he says, of course I did. And Mike basically threatens to go and look up the paperwork and prove that this woman never existed. And Henry doesn't say a word. He just gets up and leaves the room.
He practically runs out of there.
And I was okay with that. I mean, Henry deserved it. But then Mike turns on the rest of the group and he says, he came in here and he knew that you would all believe it because you all come in here and tell each other your sad stories and just feed off each other's misery.
Right. And this reminds me of Jimmy to an extent about really having low respect for suckers. And I think what Mike sees here, first of all, are a bunch of suckers who got fooled by this Henry character. And on top of that, he, like a lot of these other criminal types, I think they feel that they have some leg up on society, or that they know something everyone else doesn't. And to an extent they do, because they're involved in this whole seedy underbelly, this all these inner workings of something that most people don't know the slightest thing about it, right? And especially he's seen both sides of it, because he's seen, he's been in the police too, and whatever kind of field you're working in that involves either protecting society in a way that they'll never really understand, or being involved in crime and that kind of thing in a way that's very clandestine, he probably feels alienated and removed from the average person. And so he really just can't stand seeing them just feeding off of each other's misery and allowing themselves just to be so gullible when it's someone he can see right through.
No, I think that's right. And I haven't fully worked through how this puzzle piece fits in. But so the next line after Mike calls all of them out, they all look at him clearly upset. And Mike says, "He wanted me to talk. I talked." So we're back to the line that sort of opened up the episode. And so now we see what led to Mike saying that. If you go back to the beginning of the episode, we had the flashback where Mike is building the carport in front of Maddie. And it cuts from that flashback to Mike's face. And I think the implication is that Mike was remembering that flashback. So I'm trying to understand what the connection would be between Mike thinking about that particular memory with Maddie and how that would lead to him feeling like he wants to call these people out. The connection between that memory and Henry, I can see. Mike's thinking about his dead son. This guy is coming in and basically trampling on the memories of any dead person who mattered to people. And he's not taking it seriously, so Mike wants to call him out. Why he wants to call out everybody else, I think the theory you laid out makes sense, but I'm wondering if there is some kind of connection to draw between that memory.
Right, and I think they included the memory for a reason, and they cut from the memory to the group for a reason. And so I think you're right that there's a connection. If I put on my psychologist hat for a moment, I think he's projecting. You see Mike looking like a sad old basset hound. He's got these weary eyes, and they're tearful. He's not quite crying, but he looks like a broken person. But I don't think he can really accept those feelings, or he doesn't want to. And it's because he doesn't want to be the type of person who's just wrapped up in his own misery. He kind of diverts and just calls out that guy almost as a way to distract himself from what he's feeling and take this out on another person and someone who deserved it. And then he calls out all the other people in the group for getting wrapped up in their own misery, because that's exactly what he's trying to resist doing himself.
Right, and let me add one more little piece to this. I think it's important that the memory wasn't just a memory of Maddie, it was a memory of Mike doing something productive, building something. So that is the opposite of being the sad sack feeling bad for yourself. So I think that's the connection there.
Right, yeah. And that's Mike's a fixer. He does things, he gets the job finished, and he can't stand people who just chase their own tail feeling sorry for themselves.
Yep, I think that's right.
Yeah, and so I think that's in the same way that we say Jimmy is motivated by this aversion to suckers, I think Mike is motivated by an aversion to staying still.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah.
The next time we see Mike, he's back at another one of the warehouses playing his sort of consultant role, walking around, calling people out. He calls out the temperature in one of the trucks being wrong, the strap on one of the crates, I think tearing a little bit. It's frayed, exactly. And there's one particular guy that he's walking around with. So you just see this guy getting called out over and over. Another entertaining scene. I think the idea of putting Mike in this situation was a good one, and it's they've delivered a lot of humor through that. At a certain point, Mike gets a call on his cell phone. He ignores it. A few minutes later, somebody calls the warehouse directly. It's for Mike. Somebody on the line says he wants to see you. And Mike seems annoyed, was my read. He goes, "Yep, okay," and kind of slams the phone.
Yeah, he was definitely annoyed.
I think it was pretty clear that the person who wants to see him is Gus. And my thought in the moment was we suspected that part of the reason Mike has been going around playing this consultant role is because he wants to get Gus's attention. So I thought, this is exactly what you wanted. But then he seemed annoyed about it. And I think the reason why becomes a little bit clear in the next scene. So Mike goes to meet Gus And where else do you meet Gus but between a few trucks in the middle of the night with a lot of shadowy figures around? And Gus has...
That's where Gus is in his element.
Yeah, exactly.
Gus is in his element either when he's at that Pollo's distribution center in the middle of the night or when he's talking to customers at his restaurant.
Right. Exactly. Two situations where he is very comfortable. And you know this is going to be a good scene because Gus is clearly frustrated and he's coming to call out Mike, and to watch those two characters butt heads is awesome.
Nacho Varga. I wondered when you were going to get around to this.
You came to me. You asked for a favor. You looked me in the eye. You shook my hand. And all the while, you knew Varga was moving against my interests.
I said I wouldn't kill Salamanca. I never promised to be his bodyguard. So, what now? You gonna make a move, you better make it. But they're not gonna, are they? You brought me here because you haven't asked. So why don't you stop running a game on me and just
Gus
tell me about the
essentially says
job?
to Mike, if we're going to continue this relationship, then we have a matter we have to discuss. Do you want to tell me something? And Mike says, Nacho? And apparently Gus is frustrated and he's pissed off because he's obviously not happy that Nacho made a move against Hector. And Gus has pieced together that Mike was aware that this was going to happen. And Mike essentially says, I told you I wouldn't kill Hector, never said I'd be his bodyguard. And then he calls out Gus and says, look, if you're going to make a move, you better make it. Clearly you're not going to. You brought me here because you have an ask, so why don't you just tell me about the job? And that's the end of the episode.
Yeah, and he's totally right. Mike had no responsibility to protect Hector, and Gus is pretty clearly aware of that because he's not punishing Mike. He's basically, he has Mike there to do a job, but it's like, well, while Mike's here, I'm going to give him a hard time.
Right, exactly. And I think, so I had a hard time understanding Mike's attitude in the previous scene where he seemed sort of annoyed with this whole situation. And the more I thought about it, I think it's all just in the vein of he's just sick of everyone's BS. Gus wants to meet him, and he has to do it in this shadowy way where somebody calls up the warehouse. He has to jump through all these hoops. If you've got something to ask, just ask it.
Yeah, I agree. I think that's a big part of it, a big part of his annoyance. On top of that, Mike is very aware of the many layers of things that are going on. And I bet he kind of knew that this was coming. He probably knew that Gus would find out that Mike was aware of Nacho's plans, and at some point Gus would confront him about it. He probably knew it was coming. He just didn't want to deal with it.
He actually explicitly stated that he knew it was coming. He said to Gus, I was wondering when you were going to ask me about that.
Oh, yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
So as soon as he gets that call, he's like, all right, I got to deal with this now.
Do you have any idea what Gus is going to ask of him?
I'm not sure, but if I had to guess, I would think it has something to do with Nacho. Either helping to continue basically to use Nacho as a tool, or maybe kill him.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time imagining. I mean, there's not a. I was going to say there's not a whole lot Mike can do. That's obviously not true. He's capable of a lot, but clearly it's he's got some pretty specific skills, right? He can kill, he can cover up people that got killed, mainly things that involve killing.
Yeah, well, and he knows a lot. he has a lot of the skills that relate to knowing what law enforcement will do.
That's true. That's true. So, yeah, I don't really have a solid prediction on this one. I think you're right. It probably has something to do either with Nacho or somehow Gus needs Mike's help to continue his plan of expanding territory.
Right. Yeah, and the reason I suspect that this will involve Nacho is not because of any foreshadowing in the plot, but because just in general, the writers like to have the plots intersect and weave together. So it would just be fairly fitting for Mike and Nacho's paths to cross yet again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, agreed. And that just makes me wonder that we're 4 episodes into a 10-episode season now, and it still seems like no closer to the Jimmy and Mike storylines intersecting. But I do wonder if Ira will, as Jimmy moves down that criminal road with Ira, if that will maybe be the thing that finally connects these two storylines. But
I
we'll
hope so.
see. Yeah.
Yeah, I can't wait to see them working together, tag teaming problems. And I really can't wait for Jimmy to get his license back so he can start practicing law, because I think it's pretty clear. I think that's when he'll become Saul. Mm-hmm. And can't wait to see that.
Right. It feels a little bit like he's revving his engine right now, getting involved as you put it, sort of the resource for criminals. Engine's revving. As soon as he gets that license back, he's Saul Goodman. Just like the writers of Better Call Saul, we don't like to leave any threads open. If you recall in the last episode of Saulcast, I mentioned that you and I, Adam, we tend to be on the sidelines. We watch Better Call Saul, we comment on it, analyze it. But one of us took one little step over the line a little bit, got a little bit closer into the world of Better Call Saul. And I said I would talk about that on this episode. So you can find us on Twitter at SaulcastPod. And I made a couple tweets earlier this week, and they were liked by Luis Moncada, who is one of the 2 Salamanca twins, played by Luis Moncada and Daniel Moncada.
Ooh.
And I have to say, it was a good tweet, too. Let me look it up and I'll read it for you. Girl Callie 1372 tweeted, "I know the cousins get paid well for their House of Horrors disappearing acts, but it would make sense if they didn't wear such expensive clothing while lopping heads off and shit." And so I stepped in and said, they're probably wearing tactile suits like the ones James Bond and John Wick wear. 10 minutes later, liked by Luis Moncada.
That is awesome.
So follow us on Twitter, and that's the kind of stuff that you're missing out on if you're not following us. And who knows who will like our tweets next? You know, could be
Skinny Pete.
Could be Skinny Pete.
Maybe one of the Nazis from Breaking Bad.
Badger.
Yeah, you don't want to miss that.
Yeah.
What more is there?
I wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
What? All right, hold on. I don't want to get mad. But what? I mean, just could you follow us on Twitter, please?
Yeah. What's the matter with you? We're not. This is a one-time deal. We're telling you about the most interesting thing that could have ever happened.
This is the most interesting thing that's ever happened to me in my life.
Yeah. And if you want to know next time something like this happens, we're not always going to be there to tell you about it. Some things you got to find out for yourself by following us on Twitter at SaulcastPod. Sorry for getting angry, okay? It won't happen again.
Yeah. Sorry. I'm Gil.
I'm Adam. And this is Saulcast. Whatever podcast app you're using to listen to this, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, Google Play, maybe you just use one of those cups with string attached to it. You put it up to your ear. I don't know, but whatever it is, I'm sure it has a subscribe button. If you push that subscribe button, you'll get our episodes twice a week, And we would love to see you do that, because every download we get really makes our day, motivates us to get the show out as quickly as possible, even if it means staying up late, to record an instant take. We have a lot of fun doing it, and we hope you enjoy listening to it. It would also mean a lot to us if you could please rate and review the podcast, or if you don't have time, just quick rating. You just got to push the stars button, and that would also go a long way toward helping us grow.
It's good. I like that.